The Medici. Banking, blood, and the Renaissance. The narrow streets of 14th century Florence pulsed with a different kind of energy than the other cities of Italy. Here, commerce was not merely a means of survival, but a source of pride, a justification for ambition, a substitute for the aristocratic lineage that the great merchant families could never claim through birth. The wool trade that had made Florence wealthy was giving way to something more sophisticated, more lucrative, and more dangerous: the handling of money itself, the extension of credit to kings and popes, the management of fortunes that dwarfed the treasuries of many sovereign states. In this world of fluctuating exchange rates and sovereign debt, a new class of men was arising, men whose power derived not from ancestral lands or military prowess, but from the mysterious alchemy of finance. Among these men, one family would rise above all others, transforming themselves from mere bankers into princes of the Renaissance, patrons of art and architects of power whose influence would be felt for centuries. The story of the Medici begins not with gold coins or papal tiara, but with a young man who inherited a small shop and an audacious vision of what money could become. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici was born in 1360, the son of Everardo di Bicci de' Medici, who operated a modest money-changing business in the heart of Florence. The Medici name, which would eventually become synonymous with Renaissance power and artistic patronage, was at this time merely one among many that populated the guild lists of the Tuscan city. The family had achieved enough prosperity to earn a place among the minor guilds, but they remained far below the great banking houses and merchant princes who dominated Florentine commerce. Giovanni's early years were shaped by the financial crises that periodically devastated the Italian economy, including the catastrophic collapse of the Medici Bank in 1343, which had eliminated one of Florence's leading financial institutions and created opportunities for whoever could fill the vacuum. The young Giovanni grew up understanding both the extraordinary profits that banking could generate and the terrible risks that accompanied them, lessons that would shape his entire career. The establishment of the Medici Bank in the final years of the 14th century was not, in its initial stages, a particularly remarkable event. Florence already hosted numerous banking operations, and a new firm faced the challenge of establishing credibility in a market dominated by established competitors. What distinguished Giovanni de' Bicci from his rivals was not any particular innovation in financial technique, but rather a conservative approach that prioritized stability over speculative gain. While other bankers pursued high-risk ventures that could produce enormous returns, Giovanni concentrated on the fundamental business of accepting deposits, extending credit, and facilitating the exchange of currencies that the international trade of the period required. This cautious strategy proved its value during the financial crises that periodically swept through the Italian peninsula, when more aggressive competitors failed and the Medici emerged with their reputation intact. The firm's capital grew steadily. Branch operations opened in major commercial centers across Europe, and Giovanni accumulated the wealth that would launch his family's ascent to power. The genius of Giovanni de' Bicci's banking operations lay not merely in the accumulation of capital, but in his understanding of how financial power could be converted into political influence. Florence was a republic in name, governed by a complex system of councils and magistracies that theoretically distributed power among the city's leading families. In practice, effective control depended on the ability to manage the electoral mechanisms, influence the deliberations of the councils, and manipulate the periodic changes of government that were a feature of Florentine politics. Giovanni understood that his bank's extensive international connections gave him information and leverage that few others could match, and he used these assets to cultivate relationships with whoever held power at any given moment. This policy of accommodating whoever was in charge might seem like mere opportunism, but it reflected a deeper recognition that political stability was essential for business success, and that the Medici could prosper regardless of which faction controlled the Florentine government. The turning point in Giovanni di Bicci's career came in 1402, when he was appointed to manage the papal finances. The papacy, which had returned to Rome from Avignon in 1378 after decades of schism and conflict, was in desperate need of reliable bankers to handle the revenues that flowed into the Holy See from across Catholic Europe. Giovanni's reputation for prudence and reliability made him an attractive candidate, and the contract he negotiated gave the Medici Bank a virtual monopoly on papal financial operations. This appointment transformed the Medici from one among many Florentine banking houses into an institution of international significance, connected to the most powerful religious authority in Christendom and positioned to profit from the vast revenues that the Church commanded. The terms of the arrangement were extraordinarily favorable to Giovanni, who received a percentage of all funds passing through the papal accounts, and who was permitted to use these funds for his own operations, subject to minimal oversight. The gold of Florence had found its way to Rome, and the Medici would never be the same. The wealth that Giovanni di Bicci accumulated through his banking operations was extraordinary by any standard. His personal fortune grew to the point where he could make large loans to the Florentine government, to foreign monarchs, and to the occasional pope, positioning himself as a creditor to the most powerful figures in Europe. Yet despite his enormous wealth, Giovanni maintained a personal style that was notable for its restraint. Unlike some of his contemporaries who displayed their prosperity through extravagant spending on palaces and art collections, Giovanni lived relatively modestly, concentrating his expenditures on charitable works and religious foundations that enhanced his reputation without attracting the envy that conspicuous consumption often provoked. This combination of enormous wealth and personal frugality made Giovanni a figure of respect even among those who might resent the power that money could buy, and it established a pattern that his successors would emulate in varying degrees. The political situation in Florence during Giovanni di Bicci's later years was characterized by instability and factional conflict that threatened the arrangements he had constructed. The Chiompi revolts of 1378, a violent uprising by Florence's wool workers, had destabilized the existing political order and created openings for new actors to enter the game of power. In the years that followed, various factions competed for control of the Florentine government, with the Albizzi family emerging as the dominant force in the 1390s and early 1400s. Giovanni di Bicci navigated these turbulent waters with considerable skill, maintaining his banking relationships with whoever was in power while carefully avoiding entanglement in the factional conflicts that consumed his rivals. This strategy of calculated neutrality was not merely defensive. It positioned the Medici as a source of stability that all factions could trust, making them an indispensable part of the Florentine political system, even as that system lurched from crisis to crisis. The legacy that Giovanni di Bicci left when he died in 1429 was extraordinary by any measure. The Medici Bank had grown from a modest Florentine operation into an international financial power with branches across Europe, extensive connections to the papal court, and relationships with the most important political figures of the age. Giovanni had accumulated a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in Italy, and he had done so while maintaining a reputation for reliability and fairness that enhanced rather than diminished his standing. Most importantly, he had established the political and financial foundations that his son Cosimo would inherit and expand, creating the platform from which the Medici would launch their transformation of Florence. The gold that Giovanni had accumulated would become the foundation for an empire of art and power. But in his own time, it was enough to have made the Medici the most successful bankers in Europe. The transformation from banking to dynasty would have to wait for the next generation. The world that Giovanni de' Bicci left behind was one of extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary danger for those who sought to build lasting power. Florence remained a republic in form, with elaborate mechanisms designed to prevent any single family from dominating the government permanently. The great banking houses competed ruthlessly for advantage, and the political factions that controlled the city could turn on their allies with devastating speed. The church remained a source of enormous wealth and influence, but it was also a source of unpredictable demands and dangerous dependencies. Giovanni had navigated these hazards with considerable skill, building the Medici Bank into a powerhouse without ever allowing his family to become a target for the jealousies that such success inevitably provoked. His son Cosimo would inherit not only the family fortune, but also the delicate political position that Giovanni had constructed. And it would be Cosimo who would transform the Medici from the most successful bankers in Florence into something far more dangerous, the de facto rulers of one of the great cities of the Renaissance. The man who would become known as Cosimo the Magnificent inherited more than his father Giovanni de' Bicci's banking empire. He inherited a delicate political position that required all of his considerable abilities to maintain. Cosimo de' Medici was born in 1389, the son of Giovanni and his wife Piccarda Bueri, and from his earliest years he was prepared for the role he would eventually play in Florentine and European history. Unlike his father, who had maintained a careful distance from the political controversies that swirled around him, Cosimo understood that true power required direct engagement with the mechanisms of government. The Medici Bank that Giovanni had built was merely the foundation. Cosimo would construct the political and cultural edifice that would carry the family name into immortality. The transformation from banker to prince was not something that could be accomplished overnight, and the process would test every resource of character that Cosimo possessed, including his ability to survive adversity and return from defeat stronger than before. Cosimo's early career was shaped by his father's careful management of the transition to the next generation. Giovanni de' Bicci had recognized that wealth alone was insufficient to guarantee the family's long-term position in Florence's treacherous political environment, and he had worked to build relationships with the various factions that competed for control of the Republic. Upon Giovanni's death in 1429, these relationships passed to his son, along with the banking empire and the accumulated capital that made the Medici financially preeminent. Cosimo initially pursued a strategy of calculated restraint, allowing other families to occupy the most visible positions of power, while the Medici consolidated their economic position and expanded their network of alliances. This approach was consistent with Giovanni's legacy of cautious expansion, but it also reflected Cosimo's recognition that overt bids for power in Florence inevitably provoked opposition from those who feared Medici dominance. The turning point in Cosimo's political career came in the early 1430s, when the balance of power in Florence shifted in ways that required him to become more directly involved. The Albizzi family, led by Rinaldo degli Albizzi, had emerged as the dominant force in Florentine politics, and their faction was increasingly hostile to the growing influence of the Medici. Rinaldo was a traditional aristocrat who resented the upstart bankers who threatened to displace the old noble families from their positions of leadership, and he worked systematically to build a coalition that could marginalize the Medici and reduce their political influence. The struggle between the Albizzi and the Medici would dominate Florentine politics for the next 2 decades, and it would eventually produce a crisis that threatened to destroy everything the Medici had built. The conflict between Cosimo and Rinaldo was not merely a personal rivalry, it represented a fundamental contest between 2 visions of Florence's future. Rinaldo and his supporters represented the old order, a system in which political power was distributed among the great families according to their ancestral standing and their traditional relationships with the guilds and the church. Cosimo, by contrast, represented a new form of power based on economic resources and the ability to provide services to the state and to influential individuals. The Medici banking operations had generated enormous capital that could be deployed to support allies, to advance candidates for office, and to influence the decisions of those who governed the Republic. This economic power was, in Rinaldo's view, illegitimate, a corruption of the traditional order that placed wealth above birth and threatened to subvert the republican institutions that had governed Florence for centuries. The first round of this conflict went to Rinaldo in September 1433, with Cosimo's rivals in control of the key governmental bodies. The Medici leader was arrested and imprisoned on charges of seeking to subvert the Republic and make himself Prince of Florence. The evidence against Cosimo was thin, typical of political prosecutions in Renaissance Italy. But the momentum was with his enemies, and it seemed that the Medici dynasty would end as abruptly as it had begun. Cosimo was brought before a council that was dominated by his adversaries, and he was condemned to exile from Florence, a sentence that was tantamount to a death sentence for a family whose entire position depended on their presence in the city. He was permitted to retire to Padua rather than face the death penalty. But the sentence was explicit that any return to Florence would result in his execution. The Medici Bank continued to operate, managed by associates who remained in Florence, but the family that had risen so high seemed to have fallen forever. Cosimo's exile lasted only 13 months, but those months transformed him from a powerful banker into a figure of European significance. During his time in Padua and later in Venice, Cosimo was treated with the deference due to a great prince rather than a disgraced exile, and he discovered that his reputation and his resources made him a force to be reckoned with wherever he went. The Florentines who had driven him out began to discover that the Medici Bank's networks were not so easily replaced, that the international connections that Cosimo had cultivated over decades could not simply be transferred to other hands. More importantly, the political situation in Florence deteriorated rapidly in Cosimo's absence, with Rinaldo's faction proving unable to govern effectively and alienating potential allies through their arrogance and incompetence. By the autumn of 1434, a coalition of merchants, guild leaders, and aristocrats who had grown tired of Albizzi domination was prepared to bring Cosimo back, and the forces that had exiled him found themselves powerless to resist. The return of Cosimo de' Medici in October 1434 was a triumph that surpassed anything the city had seen in generations. He entered Florence not as a condemned exile returning under duress, but as a conquering hero, welcomed by crowds that lined the streets to witness the spectacle of his homecoming. The government that had expelled him was swept away, and in its place emerged a new arrangement that gave Cosimo and his supporters decisive control over the key institutions of the Republic. Rinaldo degli Albizzi, who had orchestrated Cosimo's exile, found himself condemned to the same fate he had inflicted on his rival, driven into permanent exile while his property and political influence were confiscated. The reversal was complete. The men who had believed they had destroyed the Medici found themselves destroyed in turn. Cosimo had learned the first lesson of Renaissance politics. Defeat was not permanent, and the ability to return from adversity was often more important than avoiding it in the first place. The period of Cosimo's ascendancy after 1434 marked the beginning of Medici domination of Florentine politics that would continue with brief interruptions for the next 3 centuries. Rather than claiming the title of prince or establishing an explicit monarchy, Cosimo preferred to exercise power through the traditional republican institutions, controlling appointments, influencing elections, and directing policy without appearing to violate the city's constitutional forms. This approach of informal dominance was more stable than overt autocracy because it preserved the appearances that Florentine tradition demanded while concentrating actual power in Medici hands. The other great families learned to accommodate themselves to Medici leadership, recognizing that opposition was futile and that collaboration offered the best chance for their own advancement. The Republican institutions continued to function, the councils continued to meet, and the elaborate rituals of Florentine civic life continued to be observed. But everyone understood that the ultimate decision in any matter of importance rested with the man who controlled the banking resources that made Florence prosperous. Cosimo's patronage of art and culture was not merely a personal preference, but a deliberate strategy for establishing Medici dominance over the intellectual and aesthetic life of the city. He commissioned buildings, sculptures, and paintings on a scale that had never been seen in Florence before, transforming the urban landscape into a permanent monument to Medici power and taste. The Palazzo Medici, which Cosimo began constructing in 1444, became the model for Renaissance domestic architecture and housed not only the Medici family, but also the extraordinary artistic treasures that Cosimo assembled during his lifetime. He supported artists and scholars with a generosity that won their lasting loyalty, and he understood that the works they created would carry the Medici name to future generations. The famous Medici Venus, the paintings of Filippo Lippi, the sculptures of Donatello. All of these were commissions that served Medici glory while advancing the artistic achievements that made Florence the center of the Renaissance. The legacy that Cosimo left when he died in 1464 was extraordinary by any standard. He had transformed the Medici Bank into the preeminent financial institution of Europe, accumulated a personal fortune that exceeded the wealth of many sovereigns, and established his family's political dominance over Florence. More than that, he had created the template for Medici rule that his successors would follow for generations: informal dominance rather than explicit monarchy, cultivation of culture as a tool of power, and a willingness to use ruthlessness when necessary, while maintaining the appearances of republican virtue. The man who had been driven into exile as a traitor returned to be honored as the father of his country, and the city that had sentenced him to death eventually interred him with the honors reserved for saints and heroes. Cosimo the Magnificent had earned his title not through the accident of birth or the acquisition of wealth, but through the exercise of power that transformed the world around him. The Medici dynasty had begun in earnest. The young man who would become the most celebrated Medici of all received his education in the full glare of Florentine attention, trained from childhood for the role he would eventually play in the history of his city and his era. Lorenzo de' Medici was born on January 1st, 1449, the eldest son of Piero di Cosimo de' Medici, and from his earliest years he was marked for leadership. His grandfather Cosimo the Magnificent had established the foundations of Medici power, but it was Lorenzo who would transform that power into something approaching magic, creating a persona so compelling that he seemed to embody the very spirit of the Renaissance itself. The title Magnificent was not merely an honorific applied to Lorenzo by later historians. It was the epithet by which his contemporaries knew him, a recognition of his extraordinary presence and his ability to make everyone who encountered him feel that they were in the presence of greatness. Lorenzo would need every ounce of this magnificence to navigate the crises that would confront him, including the most dramatic assassination attempt the Renaissance had ever witnessed. Lorenzo's education was designed to produce a ruler rather than merely a banker, a significant shift from the priorities that had guided his ancestors' approach to the next generation. He studied the classics under the finest scholars that Florence could provide, learning Latin and Greek well enough to compose poetry in both languages that impressed even professional humanists. He trained in the martial arts that were expected of Florentine gentlemen, developing the physical skills that would allow him to command respect in a society where personal prowess still mattered. He learned the family business, of course, understanding the banking operations that provided the financial foundation for Medici power, but he also learned to see beyond mere profit to the larger questions of strategy and statecraft that determine the fate of nations. By the time he came of age, Lorenzo was the most comprehensively educated member of his family, and he understood how to use that education to charm and persuade those he wished to influence. The political situation that Lorenzo inherited upon his father's death in 1469 was more stable than the situation his grandfather had faced, but it was still characterized by the inherent instability of Florentine Republican politics. The mechanisms that Cosimo had established to maintain Medici dominance continued to function, but they required constant attention and occasional adjustment to remain effective. The great families that resented Medici leadership had not disappeared. They had merely learned to operate within the constraints that Medici power imposed, waiting for opportunities that might allow them to challenge the established order. Lorenzo understood that maintaining Medici dominance would require more than merely preserving the arrangements his grandfather had created. It would demand constant vigilance, strategic manipulation of the city's factional conflicts, and the cultivation of relationships that extended far beyond Florence's walls to the courts of Europe and the leadership of the Catholic Church. Lorenzo's approach to political leadership differed significantly from the cautious strategies that had characterized his grandfather's rule. Where Cosimo had preferred to exercise influence quietly, through behind-the-scenes manipulation and the careful cultivation of relationships, Lorenzo embraced a more visible role that made him the public face of Florentine power. He understood that the appearance of leadership was often as important as its reality, and he cultivated a persona that combined the authority of a prince with the accessibility of a citizen of the Republic. He walked the streets of Florence without guards, greeting merchants and craftsmen by name, attending festivals and participating in the civic rituals that bound the community together. This accessibility was carefully managed, of course. Lorenzo was always surrounded by loyal supporters who could protect him if necessary, but it created an impression of proximity to the people that made his dominance seem less threatening than it might otherwise have appeared. The cultural achievements of Lorenzo's Florence represented the fullest expression of the Renaissance ideal, a flowering of art and scholarship that transformed the city into the wonder of the contemporary world. Lorenzo gathered around him the most talented artists of his age, supporting them with commissions that allowed them to achieve their greatest work. Sandro Botticelli painted his mythological masterpieces and his celebrated portraits of Medici family members. Michelangelo, still a teenager when Lorenzo recognized his genius, was invited to live in the Medici palace and trained under the patronage that would shape his entire career. The poet Poliziano served as Lorenzo's tutor and as the intellectual ornament of his court. The scholar and philosopher Giovanni Pico della Mirandola composed his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man under Lorenzo's protection. The list of artistic and intellectual achievements associated with Lorenzo's Florence reads like a catalog of Renaissance genius, and it reflects the deliberate investment that Lorenzo made in using culture as a tool of power. The significance of Lorenzo's cultural patronage extended beyond the creation of individual masterpieces to the transformation of Florence itself into a work of art. The city that emerged from Lorenzo's patronage was not merely a collection of buildings and streets, but a carefully crafted environment that expressed the values and aspirations of its ruling class. The Palazzo Medici, which Lorenzo expanded and decorated during his rule, became a model for Renaissance domestic architecture, its facade and its interior chapels displaying the artistic achievements that Medici wealth had made possible. The churches and public buildings that Lorenzo commissioned or renovated carried the Medici message to every corner of the city. Even the ceremonial life of Florence was reshaped to enhance Medici prestige, with festivals and processions that reinforced the association between Medici rule and civic glory. Lorenzo understood that power was not merely a matter of military force or economic resources. It was also a matter of perception, and he devoted enormous energy to shaping how both contemporaries and posterity would understand the world he had created. The international dimension of Lorenzo's power was equally remarkable, reflecting his understanding that Florence's prosperity depended on its position within the larger European system of states. He cultivated relationships with the major powers of his era, including the papacy, the French monarchy, and the various Italian states that competed for influence on the peninsula. These relationships were not merely diplomatic formalities. They involved genuine engagement with the major issues of the day, including the recurrent conflicts between the Italian states and the threat of foreign intervention that would eventually lead to the disasters of the 1490s. Lorenzo positioned himself as a mediator and arbiter of Italian disputes, enhancing Florentine prestige while extracting concessions that served the city's interests. His influence extended to the papal court as well, where he worked to advance Medici candidates for the tiara and to ensure that the church's policies were favorable to Florentine commercial interests. The dark side of Lorenzo's magnificence was never far from the surface, and the methods that maintained Medici power revealed the ruthlessness that underlay the cultural achievements. Lorenzo understood that the political system he had inherited required the occasional demonstration of Medici's strength, and he did not hesitate to employ violence when necessary. Enemies of the family were exiled, their properties confiscated, their political influence destroyed. Rivals who threatened Medici dominance were isolated through a combination of bribery, manipulation, and naked coercion. The Florentine Republican institutions that theoretically distributed power among the citizenry were carefully managed to ensure that Medici candidates always won the key offices and that decisions favorable to Medici interests were always adopted. This combination of cultural refinement and political ruthlessness was not a paradox. It was the essence of Renaissance politics, in which the same figures who supported artistic achievement also practiced the most brutal forms of realpolitik. Lorenzo embodied both aspects of his age, and he did so with a magnificence that made his rule seem not merely tolerable, but desirable. The morning of April 26, 1478, dawned clear and bright over Florence, and the city's inhabitants gathered in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore for what promised to be one of the most significant religious ceremonies of the year. Pope Sixtus IV had placed Florence under an interdict, cutting the city off from the sacraments of the church, and the ceremony that would take place that morning was designed to lift this ecclesiastical punishment and restore Florence to full communion with Christendom. The flower-decked cathedral filled with the leading citizens of Florence, their families and retinues filling every available space to witness the reconciliation between the Florentine Republic and the papacy. Among those present were Lorenzo de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano, attending with all the ceremonial pomp that their position required. What none of them knew was that within the sacred precincts of the cathedral, a conspiracy was taking shape that would shake the foundations of Florentine power and culminate in one of the most dramatic assassinations in Renaissance history. The Pazzi family, from whom the conspiracy took its name, were among the wealthiest and most ambitious in Florence, and their rivalry with the Medici had been building for years. Francesco de' Pazzi, the family's leader, was a man of enormous pride and equally enormous resentment, convinced that the Medici had unjustly monopolized the political and economic power that should properly belong to his own house. The Medici Bank had once been a formidable competitor to the Medici financial empire, but a series of setbacks and poor decisions had left them trailing behind their rivals. Francesco believed that the Medici had actively worked to undermine his family's interests, manipulating political arrangements and commercial relationships to weaken the Pazzi position. This resentment was compounded by the personal injuries that the Medici had inflicted. Lorenzo had married Clarice Orsini, a woman whom Francesco had hoped to marry himself, and the insult had never been forgotten. The Pazzi conspiracy was Francesco's answer to these accumulated grievances. an attempt to remove the Medici by assassination and seize the power that he believed was rightfully his. The conspiracy that Francesco de Pazzi assembled was remarkable for both its scope and the sophistication of its planning. He had recruited a remarkable group of collaborators, including members of the Pazzi family itself, disaffected Florentine nobles who chafed under Medici dominance, and, most remarkably, high officials of the Catholic Church who were willing to gamble everything on the success of the plot. Archbishop Francesco Salviati of Pisa, who would have been a natural ally of the Medici given their close relationship with the papacy, had instead joined the conspiracy with enthusiasm, seeing the Medici as obstacles to his own ambitions and the Pazzi as instruments of his revenge. The Pope himself, Sixtus IV, had grievances against Lorenzo that made him at least passively sympathetic to the conspirators, though he would later deny any involvement in the actual assassination plot. The conspiracy thus brought together enemies of the Medici from multiple directions, united only by their desire to see Lorenzo and his family destroyed. The plan that emerged from the conspirators' meetings was elegant in its simplicity and audacious in its execution. The assassination would take place during the cathedral ceremony, when Lorenzo and Giuliano would be surrounded by their supporters but unable to resist effectively in the sacred space. Several assassins would participate, each assigned to strike a specific target, with backup killers ready to intervene if the first attempt failed. The assassination would be followed immediately by an uprising, with the conspirators seizing key government buildings and rallying the population to their cause. Francesco de Pazzi himself would take the lead in the public phase of the plot, presenting himself as a liberator who had freed Florence from Medici tyranny. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and the element of shock, qualities that the conspirators believed would carry them to victory before the Medici supporters could respond. The moment of the attack came during the elevation of the host, that sacred instant when the cathedral should have been silent in religious reverence. Giuliano de' Medici, who had been standing near the high altar, was the first target, attacked by Bernardo Bondi and Francesco de Pazzi himself with weapons they had concealed beneath their cloaks. The blows fell with terrible precision, Giuliano unable to defend himself against an assault he had never anticipated. He fell to the cathedral floor, blood pouring from his wounds, and by the time the attacking conspirators turned their attention to Lorenzo, Giuliano was already dying. Lorenzo, however, had survived the initial assault, managed to dodge the blade that was meant to kill him, and fled toward the sacristy with his attackers in pursuit. The chaos that followed was absolute screams, running figures, the confusion of terrified worshippers who could not understand what was happening in the sacred space where they had gathered to celebrate God's mercy. The aftermath of the failed assassination revealed both the depths of the conspirators' miscalculation and the terrifying efficiency of Medici retribution. Francesco de Pazzi, who had expected to emerge as the hero of a popular uprising, found himself instead surrounded by a hostile populace that had not forgotten the Medici's benefits. The people of Florence, whatever their private resentments against Medici dominance, were not prepared to accept assassination in the cathedral as a legitimate means of political change. Francesco was captured within hours of the attack, and his subsequent execution would be among the most brutal that Florence had ever witnessed. Archbishop Salviati, who had attempted to seize the government buildings during the confusion, was captured and hanged from the Palazzo della Signoria alongside his co-conspirators. The bodies of the executed conspirators were displayed from the windows of the palace, a warning to anyone who might contemplate similar schemes in the future. The message was clear. The Medici might cultivate the trappings of republican virtue, but they would respond to assassination attempts with the full fury of absolute power. The personal dimension of the Pazzi conspiracy was the death of Giuliano de' Medici, whose killing left Lorenzo alone among his generation of the family and fundamentally altered the character of his rule. Giuliano had been more than Lorenzo's brother. He had been his partner in both business and politics, a figure whose presence provided balance and whose judgment Lorenzo had trusted implicitly. The grief that Lorenzo felt at his brother's death was genuine and profound, and it manifested in ways that surprised those who knew him. He withdrew from public life for weeks, neglecting the duties of government and the management of the bank to mourn in private. When he finally emerged, he was a changed man, more suspicious, more ruthless, less willing to trust even his closest associates. The brother who had moderated his impulses was gone, and in his place emerged a Lorenzo who would stop at nothing to preserve and extend Medici power. The long-term consequences of the Pazzi conspiracy extended far beyond the immediate execution of the conspirators. Lorenzo used the crisis to consolidate his position in ways that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, intimidating potential rivals and rewarding loyal supporters with new privileges and positions. The intervention of Pope Sixtus IV, who had supported the conspirators, gave Lorenzo an excuse to launch military operations against the papal states that humiliated the papacy and forced the Pope to accept terms favorable to Florence. The whole of Tuscany gradually fell under Medici domination as a result of the crisis, with independent cities and territories acknowledging Florentine supremacy in ways they had previously resisted. The Pazzi conspiracy, which had been intended to destroy the Medici, had instead made them more powerful than ever, eliminating the last serious challenges to their authority and establishing a dominance that would last for generations. Lorenzo emerged from the crisis not merely as the leader of Florence, but as the dominant figure in Italian politics, a position he would maintain for the remaining 20 years of his life. The display of the conspirators' bodies from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria became one of the defining images of Renaissance political violence, a spectacle that was remembered and depicted for generations afterward. The hanging bodies of Francesco de' Pazzi and Archbishop Salviati, swaying in the Florence wind, served as both warning and reassurance. A warning to anyone who might contemplate similar schemes, and a reassurance to the population that the Medici were capable of protecting themselves and punishing their enemies. The message was reinforced by the elaborate commemorations that Lorenzo organized to honor his brother Giuliano, including the commissioning of Michelangelo's famous statue that would stand in the Florence Cathedral as a memorial to the brother Lorenzo had loved. The Pazzi conspiracy had failed, but its failure had transformed Lorenzo from a powerful politician into something approaching a legendary figure, the survivor of an assassination attempt whose divine protection seemed manifest. The Medici would never be the same after the blood that was spilled in the cathedral that April morning, and neither would Florence. The election of Giovanni de' Medici to the papacy in 1513 marked the culmination of a transformation that the Medici family had been pursuing for generations. What Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici had begun as a modest banking operation handling papal revenues, his great-grandson would complete by actually occupying St. Peter's throne. The Medici popes, Giovanni as Leo X, Giulio as Clement VII, and the various Medici cardinals who served the church in subordinate capacities, represented the family's most ambitious venture into the accumulation of power. They transformed the papacy from an institution that the Medici served into one that they owned, using the vast resources of the Catholic Church to advance family interests and extending Medici influence to the farthest corners of Christendom. The gold that had flowed through the Medici Bank now flowed through the Vatican itself, and the family that had begun as merchants of Florence became, in a sense, merchants of salvation. Giovanni de' Medici, the future Pope Leo X, was born in 1475, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and from his earliest years he was marked for a career in the church. The pattern was familiar by now. Younger sons of the Medici family were directed toward ecclesiastical careers where they could accumulate the benefices and offices that would enhance family power without creating complications of inheritance. Giovanni was made a cardinal at the age of 13, an unprecedented elevation that reflected Medici influence rather than any spiritual qualification, and he proceeded to accumulate the educational credentials and administrative experience that would prepare him for the highest office in Christendom. When his father died in 1492, Giovanni inherited the mantle of Medici leadership in the church, and he pursued his advancement with the same calculated determination that had characterized his ancestors' pursuit of wealth and political power. The circumstances that brought Giovanni to the papacy in 1513 were shaped by the dramatic events that had transformed Italian politics during his years of preparation. The French invasion of Italy in 1494 had swept away the arrangements that Lorenzo the Magnificent had so carefully constructed, driving the Medici from Florence and establishing a republican government that expelled the family from their native city. Giovanni spent the years of exile cultivating his position in the church, accumulating benefices and building relationships with the cardinals who would eventually elect his successor. He survived the Borgia papacy of Alexander VI, the reforming zeal of Julius II, and the various political crises that threatened the church during one of its most tumultuous periods. When the cardinals convened in 1513 to elect a new pope following Julius II's death, Giovanni de' Medici was the candidate who could command the widest support, wealthy enough to buy votes, experienced enough to govern, and sufficiently malleable that the various factions believed they could control him once he was elevated. Leo X's papacy was characterized by a magnificence that surpassed anything the Roman See had previously witnessed, a continuous carnival of celebrations, commissions, and expenditures that astounded contemporaries and exhausted the church's treasury. He inherited a substantial surplus from his predecessor's frugal administration, but he proceeded to dissipate this inheritance with a generosity that knew no limits. The palaces of the Vatican were expanded and decorated with paintings by the greatest artists of the age. The streets of Rome were illuminated for festivals that lasted for days. Cardinals and ambassadors were entertained with a lavishness that made previous popes seem positively austere. The papal courts became the center of Renaissance culture, drawing artists, scholars, and writers who knew that Leo's patronage could make their careers. The expenses were enormous, but Leo seemed to believe that the resources of the church were inexhaustible and that the prestige they purchased was worth any cost. The financial methods that Leo X to sustain his magnificence would have impressed his ancestor Giovanni de' Bicci, though they would also have troubled his conscience if the Medici had retained any capacity for moral reflection. The sale of indulgences, by which the church offered remission of temporal punishment for sins in exchange for monetary contributions, became a major source of revenue during Leo's papacy. The famous indulgence that financed the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome became a trigger for Martin Luther's Reformasi. Though Leo seems to have understood neither the theological objections that the indulgence raised nor the political firestorm it would eventually produce. Beyond indulgences, Leo developed new taxes on clerical income, created new offices that could be sold to the highest bidders, and engaged in extensive borrowing from the banking houses that had once been the family business. The financial instruments that Medici bankers had invented for commercial purposes were now deployed on a cosmic scale, and the debt that Leo accumulated would burden the church for generations. The nepotism that characterized Leo X's papacy was so blatant that it became a byword throughout Christendom, and it established patterns that subsequent popes would follow with varying degrees of modification. Leo elevated dozens of cardinals, but he reserved the most important positions for members of the Medici family and their closest allies. His cousin Giulio de' Medici, who would eventually become Pope Clement VII, was groomed for the highest offices and given responsibilities that made him the virtual ruler of the church during Leo's frequent periods of illness. Leo's nephew Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, was showered with titles and territories that made him one of the great princes of Italy. The complaint that the Medici had become more powerful than the Pope himself was not entirely unjustified. Leo seemed genuinely to believe that advancing his family's interests was the same as advancing the interests of the church, and he pursued both objectives with equal enthusiasm. The consequences of Leo VI's policies extended far beyond the immediate financial difficulties that his extravagance created. The sale of indulgences and the corruption of the church's administration provided the grievances that Martin Luther would articulate in his famous theses, triggering the Reformation that would split Western Christianity and transform the political map of Europe. Leo's failure to understand the depth of popular resentment against church abuses and his preference for diplomatic solutions over genuine reform allowed the Protestant movement to grow from a theological dispute into a political revolution that no pope could control. The wars that followed would devastate Central Europe, reshape the balance of power among the great states, and create a permanent division in Christianity that persists to this day. Leo himself seems to have been largely unaware of the magnitude of the catastrophe he had helped to unleash, dying in 1521, apparently convinced that the problems of the church could be solved by better administration and more skilled diplomacy. The second Medici Pope, Giulio de' Medici, who became Clement VII in 1523, inherited the problems that Leo had created and added new ones of his own. Clement was a more serious and more learned man than his cousin, genuinely concerned with the problems of the church and sincerely committed to reform, but he was also more thoroughly compromised by the arrangements that had made his elevation possible. The Medici Bank had been reconstituted under papal protection, and Clement's financial interests were entangled with those of his family in ways that made independent action difficult. His papacy was dominated by the threat of Protestantism, the military ambitions of the Emperor Charles V, and the persistent problem of Medici family advancement. The sack of Rome in 1527, when mutinous imperial troops looted the Vatican and forced Clement to flee for his life, was the culmination of his failures. A catastrophe that destroyed whatever remained of papal prestige and demonstrated the bankruptcy of the policies that the Medici popes had pursued. The legacy of the Medici popes was thus a mixture of genuine cultural achievement and catastrophic failure. They had made the Vatican a center of Renaissance culture, commissioning works of art and architecture that remained among the treasures of Western civilization. They had extended Medici influence to the farthest reaches of the Catholic world, placing family members in positions of authority from Spain to Poland. But they had also presided over the financial exhaustion of the Church, the corruption of its spiritual mission, and the loss of half of Christendom to Protestant reform. The gold that had flowed so abundantly through the Medici Bank now flowed through the Vatican. But the spiritual authority that should have accompanied that wealth had been dissipated by the very methods used to acquire it. The Medici had become God's bankers, but the interest they extracted was paid not in money, but in souls. The small golden ring that Giuliano de' Medici allegedly carried with him wherever he went was unremarkable in appearance. A simple band of gold set with a semi-precious stone that might have been purchased from any Florentine jeweler. Yet, according to the rumors that swirled through Renaissance Italy, this unremarkable object contained a secret that made it one of the most terrifying weapons in the known world. Within the setting of the stone, accessible at the touch of a finger and invisible to all but the wearer, was a compartment that held a poison so subtle, so deadly, and so undetectable that it could kill without leaving any trace for physicians to discover. Giuliano, according to this legend, needed only to grasp the hand of an enemy in greeting, to offer a cup of wine in hospitality, to touch a rival's food with fingertips that had touched the hidden compartment, and death would follow within hours or days, natural-seeming death that no one could attribute to murder. The Medici poison ring became one of the most persistent legends of the Renaissance, a symbol of the family's alleged willingness to use any means, however dishonorable, to destroy their enemies. The origins of the poison ring legend are difficult to trace, but it seems to have crystallized during the turbulent years following the assassination of Giuliano de' Medici in 1478. The Pazzi conspiracy had failed, and the conspirators had been executed with a brutality that shocked even a city accustomed to political violence. Francesco de' Pazzi had been hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria alongside Archbishop Salviati, their bodies displayed as a warning to anyone who might contemplate similar schemes. Yet even as the executions took place, rumors began to circulate about the fate that had befallen the conspirators in their final hours. Some claimed that they had been poisoned in their cells before they could reveal the full extent of the conspiracy. Others whispered that Giuliano's ghost had appeared to the condemned men in their dreams, tormenting them with visions of the torture that awaited them. The combination of fear, guilt, and the natural human tendency to find supernatural explanations for political violence created an atmosphere in which the poison ring legend could take root and flourish. The appeal of the poison ring legend lay in its ability to explain things that would otherwise have seemed inexplicable. The sudden deaths of Medici enemies, the illnesses that struck rivals at convenient moments, the mysterious failures of conspiracies that had seemed certain to succeed. All of these could be attributed to the terrible power contained in Giuliano's ring. The ring transformed the Medici from merely ruthless politicians into something approaching sorcerers, figures who possessed knowledge and capabilities that ordinary humans could not hope to counter. This was both a curse and a blessing from the Medici perspective. It enhanced their reputation for power and deterred potential enemies who feared the invisible weapon that might be concealed in any encounter. But it also made them objects of fear and horror that complicated their efforts to present themselves as legitimate rulers of the Florentine Republic. The legend of the poison ring was, in a sense, the price the Medici paid for their success, a dark mythology that grew organically from the shadows their power cast. Historical evidence for the actual use of poison by the Medici is considerably thinner than the legend suggests, though it would be surprising if the family had never employed such methods. Renaissance politics was a brutal business, and the elimination of enemies through assassination, judicial murder, and other forms of political violence was commonplace among all the major powers of the era. The Borgias were famous for their alleged use of poison, and the Visconti of Milan had a similar reputation. It would be strange if the Medici, who were as ruthless and ambitious as any of their rivals, had entirely abstained from methods that were considered acceptable tools of statecraft. The problem is that the evidence for specific Medici poisonings is almost always ambiguous, tied up with the same kind of rumor-mongering and political propaganda that produced the poison ring legend. Deaths that were convenient for Medici interests were routinely attributed to poison by enemies seeking to blacken the family's reputation, while deaths that might actually have been caused by poison were explained away as natural causes or accidents. The most famous case that is often cited as evidence of Medici poison involves Lorenzo the Magnificent's youngest brother, Lorenzo the Younger, who died in 1499 under circumstances that have been interpreted in various ways. Contemporary accounts describe him as suffering from a persistent fever that resisted all treatment, and the pattern of his illness was consistent with certain types of slow-acting poison. Enemies of the Medici were quick to attribute his death to foul play, suggesting that someone had found a way to eliminate a potential rival for power within the family itself. Yet the evidence is far from conclusive. Fevers that resisted treatment were common in an era before modern medicine, and the assumption that someone must have poisoned Lorenzo the Younger reflects more about the suspicions that surrounded the Medici than about the actual circumstances of his death. The case illustrates the difficulty of separating fact from fiction when examining accusations of Renaissance poison. The political context made such accusations automatic, while the medical context made it impossible to disprove them definitively. The broader context in which the Medici operated helps explain why the poison ring legend became so persistent and so influential. The family had accumulated enemies through their rise to power, and those enemies had every reason to believe the worst of Medici methods. The traditional aristocratic families who had been displaced by Medici dominance resented the upstart bankers who had bought their way into positions of authority. The Republican citizens who valued Florence's tradition of collective governance resented the informal monarchy that the Medici had established. The religious reformers who criticized church corruption saw the Medici popes as symbols of everything that was wrong with the institution they sought to reform. All of these groups had incentives to believe that the Medici were capable of any crime, and the poison ring legend served their purposes perfectly. It transformed the Medici from mere politicians into monsters, figures whose removal became not merely politically desirable, but morally necessary. The reality behind the poison ring legend was probably more mundane, but no less significant. The Medici almost certainly did employ poison on occasion, as did virtually every other ruling family of the era. But they probably did not possess any secret weapon as devastating as the legend suggested. The real power of the Medici lay not in any magical ring or undetectable toxin, but in their control of financial resources, political institutions, and military force. Conventional weapons of power that were effective precisely because they were open and acknowledged. The poison ring was a metaphor for Medici power rather than a literal description of it, a way of expressing the fear and resentment that the family's dominance inspired. The legend told us less about what the Medici actually did than about what their enemies believed they might do, and that fear was in many ways more significant than any actual threat. The legacy of the poison ring legend extended far beyond the Renaissance, shaping how subsequent generations understood the Medici and their methods. The image of the scheming Florentine banker who carried death on his finger became a stock figure of Western literature and art, appearing in countless novels, plays, and films that sought to capture the intrigue and danger of Renaissance politics. The legend also served a broader purpose in Western culture, providing a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the corruption that wealth could bring. The Medici poison ring became a symbol of political murder, a shorthand for the ruthless methods that rulers would employ when their interests were threatened. Whether or not such a ring ever existed, and the historical evidence suggests it probably did not, it captured something essential about the fears and suspicions that surrounded the exercise of power in the Renaissance world. The young man who had become the first Duke of Florence was born into circumstances that would have scandalized the more respectable citizens of the Republic had they known the full truth of his origins. Alessandro de' Medici, whose exact date of birth remains uncertain but who likely came into the world around 1510 or 1511, was the son of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and a woman of such humble origins that her name was deliberately omitted from the official records. The circumstantial evidence that accumulated over subsequent centuries suggested that Alessandro's mother was a servant in the Medici household, possibly a woman of African descent, whose very existence was an embarrassment to a family that prided itself on its refinement and its classical learning. Whatever his mother's precise status, There was no question that Alessandro was illegitimate, born outside the bonds of marriage and with no legitimate claim to the inheritance that would eventually make him ruler of Florence. Yet this bastard son of the Medici would come to occupy the most powerful position in the city that his ancestors had transformed from a republic into a family fiefdom, and his violent death would become one of the most debated mysteries of the Renaissance. The circumstances of Alessandro's early life were shaped by the political upheavals that swept through Florence and Italy during his formative years. The exile of the Medici in 1494, following the French invasion that destroyed Lorenzo the Magnificent's careful arrangements, had seemed to end the family's dominance of Florentine politics. For nearly 2 decades, the Medici existed as exiles and refugees, their properties confiscated, and their political influence reduced to whatever they could achieve through diplomacy and bribery. Alessandro's father, Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, was among those who spent these years in relative obscurity, cultivating relationships with powerful figures who might eventually restore the family to prominence. The restoration of the Medici in 1512, accomplished through a combination of Spanish military force and the exhaustion of the Republican experiment, brought the family back to power, but left them dependent on foreign patrons whose interests did not always align with Florentine traditions. The elevation of Giulio de' Medici to the papacy as Clement VII in 1523 transformed the Medici position from powerful to supreme, and it was in this context that Alessandro's fortunes began to rise. Clement VII had no legitimate sons of his own, and he appears to have viewed Alessandro, his cousin, as a potential heir to the family legacy. The Pope arranged for Alessandro to be given various titles and offices, gradually building up his position in Florentine society and preparing him for the moment when he might assume a more formal role in government. The marriage that Clement arranged between Alessandro and Margaret of Austria, the illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was designed to cement an alliance between the Medici and the most powerful monarch in Europe, and it demonstrated the emperor's willingness to recognize Alessandro as a legitimate ruler of Florence. The wedding took place in 1536, and Alessandro's position as the head of the Medici family seemed secured. The creation of the Duchy of Florence in 1532 represented the final transformation of the old republican institutions into an explicit monarchy, with Alessandro as its first duke. The ceremonial that accompanied this transformation was carefully designed to emphasize both the continuity with Florentine traditions and the new reality of hereditary rule. Alessandro was not a king. Florence remained nominally a republic, but he possessed the powers that mattered: command of the military, control of the appointments to key offices, and ultimate authority over the policies that governed the city. The elaborate rituals of the Florentine Republic continued to be observed, but everyone understood that they were now subordinate to the Duke's will. The transformation had been achieved through a combination of papal pressure and Spanish military support, and Alessandro's position depended on these foreign alliances in ways that his more independent ancestors would never have tolerated. The scandals that surrounded Alessandro's rule extended beyond the question of his illegitimate birth to encompass virtually every aspect of his conduct as Duke. He was accused of arbitrary rule, of ignoring the laws and traditions that had governed Florence for centuries in favor of the personal exercise of power. He was accused of financial misconduct, of diverting public revenues to his own purposes and enriching his favorites at the expense of the treasury. He was accused of sexual misconduct, of preying upon the women of Florence with a disregard for their feelings and their honor that shocked even a society accustomed to the privileges of the powerful. The most persistent rumors suggested that Alessandro had little interest in his wife, preferring the company of young men, and that his court had become a place of vice and corruption that polluted the moral atmosphere of the entire city. Whether these accusations were entirely fair or entirely accurate, They reflected the genuine resentment that many Florentines felt toward a ruler whose authority they had never been consulted about and whose legitimacy they could not bring themselves to accept. The opposition to Alessandro's rule took various forms, from quiet resistance to open conspiracy. The old Republican families who had been displaced by the establishment of the duchy resented their loss of influence and worked clandestinely to undermine Medici authority. The citizens who remembered the days of genuine Republican governance could not accept that their city had become the personal possession of a bastard who had never done anything to earn their loyalty. Even members of the Medici family itself, who might have been expected to support their relative, had their own grievances and their own ambitions. The conspiracy that would eventually kill Alessandro was not the work of outsiders, but of insiders, men who had access to his household and his confidence, who knew his routines and his vulnerabilities, and who resolved that his rule must end. The murder of Alessandro de' Medici on January 6, 1537, was the culmination of these accumulated resentments, and it was carried out with a deliberateness that suggested long planning and careful preparation. The assassin was Lorenzo de' Medici, a young member of the family who was related to Alessandro through a different branch, and who had apparently convinced himself that he was acting in defense of Republican liberty. Lorenzo gained access to Alessandro's apartments in the Palazzo Vecchio by exploiting their personal relationship, and he murdered the Duke with the assistance of a servant who helped subdue his victim during the struggle. The body was left in the street outside the palace, arranged to suggest that Alessandro had been killed by common thieves rather than by political opponents. Lorenzo fled to Venice, where he expected to find refuge from Medici vengeance, and for a time it seemed that the assassination had succeeded in ending the Medici duchy. The aftermath of Alessandro's murder revealed both the depth of opposition to his rule and the resilience of the arrangements that supported it. Lorenzo, who had expected to be celebrated as a liberator, found that his action was condemned by virtually everyone, including those who had resented Alessandro's rule. The Florentine government declared him an outlaw and demanded his extradition from Venice. The emperor, who had arranged Alessandro's marriage to his daughter, was furious at the insult and determined to maintain Medici rule. The people of Florence, whatever their private feelings, accepted the new duke, Alessandro's cousin Francesco, with remarkably little resistance. Lorenzo himself was eventually murdered in Venice, apparently on Medici orders, and his body was displayed to demonstrate that the family would tolerate no challenges to their authority. The assassination that was supposed to restore Republican liberty had instead strengthened Medici power, confirming Francesco's position and eliminating the last serious opposition to family rule. The legacy of Alessandro de' Medici extended beyond his brief and troubled reign to encompass questions about legitimacy, succession, and the nature of political authority that the Renaissance had raised but never resolved. He had been illegitimate, foreign-born in the eyes of Florentine tradition, and dependent on foreign military force for his position. Yet he had ruled as duke, commanded the loyalty of the government apparatus, and been recognized by the major powers of Europe. The violence of his death had not been enough to undo these accomplishments, and his successor had managed to establish a more stable and legitimate-seeming rule. The story of Alessandro suggested that legitimacy was not a matter of birth or tradition, but of power successfully exercised, and that the forms of governance mattered less than the capacity to maintain order and command obedience. The Medici had become princes in everything but name, and Alessandro's brief reign had demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of their transformation. The young man, who would become known as Lorenzo the Younger, inherited a name that carried enormous weight in Florentine history, a legacy of achievement and power that would have challenged any successor to measure up. Born in 1492, the son of Piero the Unfortunate and the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. This second Lorenzo grew up in the shadow of his great namesake's reputation, surrounded by reminders of the glory that had once been Medici. His childhood was shaped by exile. The family was driven from Florence in 1494, when the French invasion destroyed the political arrangements his grandfather had so carefully constructed, and by the uncertainty that characterized Medici existence during those years of Republican restoration. Yet the Medici name proved more durable than their enemies had anticipated, and Lorenzo would eventually return to Florence, assume the leadership of his family, and rule as Duke of Urbino until his mysterious death in 1519 brought the main line of the family to an end. The years of exile were formative for Lorenzo in ways that shaped both his character and his approach to politics. The Medici family's expulsion from Florence in 1494 had been traumatic, stripping them of the properties and positions that had made them dominant for generations. Lorenzo spent his formative years in various Italian cities, learning the arts of survival and diplomacy that would stand him in good stead when the family eventually returned to power. He observed at first hand the politics of the Italian peninsula, the shifting alliances and rivalries that determined the fate of states and families alike. He developed relationships with the patrons and protectors who would eventually help restore the Medici to Florence, building the network of connections that was as important to Renaissance politics as military force or economic resources. The experience of exile gave Lorenzo an understanding of the fragility of power that his more fortunate ancestors had never developed, and it made him both more cautious and more determined than he might otherwise have been. The restoration of the Medici to Florence in 1512, accomplished through Spanish military intervention and the exhaustion of the Republican experiment, brought Lorenzo back to the city that had been his birthplace, but that he could barely remember. He was not the primary leader of the family at this point. That role fell to his cousin Giulio, who would become Pope Clement VII, but he was clearly marked for high position and significant responsibility. The second restoration was different from the first in important ways. The Medici returned not as informal leaders of a republic, but as candidates for more explicit authority. And the political arrangements they established would gradually evolve into the hereditary duchy that would eventually replace the old republican institutions. Lorenzo was given the Duchy of Urbino as his personal domain, a grant that represented both his importance to the family and the precariousness of their position. It was a title that could be given and taken away depending on the political winds. The marriage that the family arranged for Lorenzo was designed to cement alliances and extend Medici influence across the Italian peninsula. His wife, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was a French princess whose connections to the French court were considered valuable assets in the complex diplomatic game that characterized Renaissance politics. The wedding in 1508 was a spectacular affair, attended by dignitaries from across Europe and celebrated with the kind of magnificence that Medici weddings had always featured. The celebration was not merely a personal event, but a political statement, demonstrating that the Medici had returned to the center of European politics and that their alliance with France was a serious commitment rather than a temporary arrangement. Lorenzo and Madeleine retired to Urbino to begin their married life, and for a brief period it seemed that the Medici had finally achieved the stability and security that their ancestors had sought for generations. The circumstances of Lorenzo's death on May 4, 1519 remain mysterious despite centuries of investigation and speculation. Contemporary accounts describe him as suffering from a persistent fever that resisted all treatment, a pattern of illness that was consistent with various possible causes, including malaria, typhoid, or the various epidemic diseases that periodically swept through Renaissance Italy. Yet the rumors that immediately began to circulate suggested darker possibilities. That Lorenzo had been poisoned by enemies who wished to harm the Medici family, that someone had found a way to introduce a deadly substance into his system that mimicked the symptoms of natural disease. The suspicions that surrounded Lorenzo's death were never resolved, and the passage of time has only deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. Whether he died of natural causes or was murdered remains uncertain, but the suspicions themselves tell us something important about the world that the Medici had created. The political implications of Lorenzo's death were immediate and far-reaching. He was the last male of the main line of the Medici family, the direct descendant of Cosimo the Magnificent and Lorenzo the Magnificent, and his death without male heirs created a succession crisis that threatened everything the family had achieved. The main line had produced no other males of marriageable age, and the family's future now depended on Giulio, Lorenzo's cousin, who would soon become Pope Clement VII. The circumstances of the succession were complicated by the fact that the family had accumulated power not through strict legal title, but through a combination of wealth, political manipulation, and foreign support. Lorenzo's death raised questions about whether these arrangements could survive the transition to a new generation, whether the Medici position was based on personal qualities that died with their possessor or on institutional foundations that could be maintained by successors. The succession crisis revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Medici position in Renaissance Italy. On one hand, the family's connections to the papacy, to foreign powers, and to the networks of credit that dominated Italian commerce gave them resources that most families could not have mobilized. Giulio de' Medici, who became the head of the family and eventually Pope Clement VII, was able to navigate the succession crisis successfully, maintaining Medici dominance through the combination of papal authority and political skill. On the other hand, the crisis demonstrated that the Medici position ultimately depended on the personal qualities of individual family members rather than on institutional arrangements that could survive the transition between generations. The elaborate system of influence and control that the Medici had constructed was fragile in ways that their more successful predecessors had never acknowledged. The end of the main Medici line with Lorenzo's death marked a turning point in the family's history, though it would take decades for the full significance to become apparent. The Medici would continue to produce notable figures, including the Grand Dukes who would rule Tuscany into the 18th century, but they would never again produce a Lorenzo the Magnificent or achieve the cultural and political dominance that the family had enjoyed during its golden age. The generation that had restored the Medici to power would pass away, and their successors would face challenges that their ancestors' wealth and connections could not always overcome. The poison or the disease that killed Lorenzo in 1509 was thus not merely a personal tragedy, but a symbolic end to an era, the closing of a chapter in Florentine and Italian history that would never be reopened. The legacy of Lorenzo the Younger and the main Medici line extended beyond the immediate political consequences of his death to encompass questions about the nature of dynastic rule and the limits of human ambition. The Medici had risen from modest origins to become the dominant force in Florence and major players in Italian and European politics, but their achievements had depended on the extraordinary qualities of individual family members. Cosimo the Magnificent, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the popes who had elevated the family to unprecedented heights. When these qualities were no longer present, when ordinary men inherited positions that had been created by extraordinary ones, the family's position became more precarious. The story of the last Lorenzo was thus a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition, about the gap between what families could achieve through talent and effort and what they could sustain through inheritance and tradition. The woman who would become the most celebrated of all Medici duchesses arrived in Florence in 1539, when the city was still recovering from the trauma of siege and the upheaval of revolution. Eleonora di Toledo was barely 16 years old when she married Cosimo de' Medici, the man who had clawed his way to power in the chaos following the Medici expulsion and established himself as the new ruler of Tuscany. Her father was the Viceroy of Naples, one of the most powerful figures in the Spanish Empire, and her marriage to Cosimo represented the alliance between Medici ambition and Habsburg authority that would shape the future of Florence. Eleonora would transform the role of Medici women, creating a model of aristocratic display and cultural patronage that her successors would follow for generations. But before she could assume her position as Duchess of Florence, she would witness the culmination of a struggle that had begun with the expulsion of her husband's ancestors, and that would determine whether the Medici would ever return to the city they had dominated for centuries. The events that led to the siege of Florence began with the dramatic expulsion of the Medici family in 1494, when the invasion of Italy by Charles VIII of France swept away the political arrangements that Lorenzo the Magnificent had so carefully constructed. The Republican government that emerged in the Medici's absence was idealistic but unstable, attempting to restore the participatory governance that had characterized earlier periods of Florentine history while facing opposition from within and without. The Republic survived for nearly 2 decades, weathering external pressures and internal divisions, but it ultimately proved unable to withstand the combination of papal ambition and foreign military force that the restored Medici and their allies brought to bear. When Spanish troops entered Florence in 1512, the Republic collapsed, and the Medici returned to assume the positions of authority they had held before their exile. The second period of Medici rule was more troubled than the first, marked by internal divisions, foreign intervention, and the fundamental tension between Republican traditions and monarchical ambitions. The Medici who returned in 1512 were not the figures who had made the family great. They were survivors who had learned the lessons of exile and who understood how precarious their position really was. The Republic that had replaced them had left deep marks on Florentine political culture, awakening memories of self-governance and citizen participation that could not easily be suppressed. The families that had led the Republican government had been exiled or marginalized, but their ideas survived, and the tension between these ideas and the Medici drive for hereditary rule would eventually produce the crisis that transformed everything. The assassination of Alessandro de' Medici in 1537, which brought Cosimo I to power, was both a symptom and a turning point, demonstrating the depth of opposition to Medici rule while simultaneously providing the family with an opportunity to start fresh. The Siege of Florence in 1529-1530 was the culmination of these accumulated tensions, a traumatic event that shattered the old city and transformed its political system more profoundly than any previous crisis. The siege began when a Republican faction, supported by elements of the Florentine population that resented Medici dominance and papal interference, seized control of the city government and declared the restoration of the Republic. Pope Clement VII, who was himself a Medici and who had initially supported the government that the siege was intended to destroy, found himself opposing the very forces he had helped to create. The imperial forces that eventually crushed the Florentine Republic were led by the Condottiero Prince of Orange, and their assault on the city's walls became one of the most dramatic military operations of the Italian Wars. The defenders fought with the desperation of people who knew that defeat meant not merely political change, but personal destruction. And the siege lasted for months, despite overwhelming imperial strength. Eleonora of Toledo did not witness the siege itself, but she arrived in Florence immediately after its conclusion, when the city was still reeling from the devastation that the imperial bombardment had inflicted. The walls that had protected Florence for centuries were breached in several places, The neighborhoods outside the walls had been reduced to rubble, and the population was suffering from the famine and disease that always followed prolonged military operations. The sight that greeted Eleonora upon her arrival was not the glittering Renaissance city of legend, but a wounded and resentful community, its population demoralized and its traditions shattered. Yet she set about the task of transforming this devastated landscape with the same determination that her husband brought to the consolidation of his power, creating the foundation for a new Medici court that would eventually rival anything the Renaissance had produced. The transformation of the Medici position from restored oligarchs to hereditary dukes was accomplished through a combination of military force, diplomatic maneuvering, and the careful manipulation of symbolic politics. Cosimo I, who had emerged from the chaos of the siege as the survivor of last men standing, understood that the old republican forms could not continue indefinitely. He gradually accumulated titles and offices that gave him the substance of monarchical power while maintaining the forms of constitutional governance, a strategy that required patience and skill, but that ultimately succeeded in making him Duke of Florence in 1569. The granducal title that he received from the papacy in 1569 was the culmination of this process, establishing the Medici as sovereigns whose authority derived from their own right rather than from delegation by the Florentine people. The transformation had taken decades to accomplish, but it had finally placed the Medici beyond the reach of the conspiracies and revolts that had threatened them since their return from exile. Eleonora's role in this transformation was more significant than the traditional emphasis on her husband's achievements might suggest. As Duchess of Florence and later Grand Duchess of Tuscany, she established the ceremonial and cultural frameworks that would define Medici rule for generations. Her household at the Palazzo Pitti became the center of Tuscan aristocratic society, a court where the great families of the region could demonstrate their loyalty to the new regime while participating in the cultural activities that the Medici sponsored. Eleonora was a patron of the arts in her own right, commissioning works that celebrated Medici power while creating an environment where artists and scholars could flourish. The famous portrait of her by Bronzino, which shows her with her son Giovanni, became one of the defining images of Medici court culture, a visual statement of the dynasty's legitimacy and its aspirations. The legacy of the siege and its aftermath extended beyond the immediate political changes to encompass fundamental transformations in the relationship between the Medici and the Florentine people. The old republican traditions that had challenged Medici authority were not entirely suppressed, but they were effectively marginalized, relegated to the status of historical memory rather than active political force. The families that had led the Republic during the siege were exiled or reconciled, their properties confiscated and their influence destroyed. The guilds and civic institutions that had given Florentine politics its distinctive character were gradually stripped of their real authority, becoming ceremonial shells that maintained the appearance of traditional governance while serving the needs of the new regime. The Florence that emerged from these transformations was no longer a republic in any meaningful sense, but a duchy, ruled by a family that had learned from centuries of experience how to maintain power without provoking the resistance that had driven their ancestors into exile. The flight of the Medici from Florence in 1494 and their final restoration in 1530 had created a pattern that would repeat itself in various forms throughout the early modern period. The family's experience of exile and return had taught them lessons that they would never forget: the importance of foreign alliances, the necessity of military strength, the value of cultural patronage in legitimizing rule. These lessons would shape Medici policy for the remainder of their dynasty, producing the Golden Age of Grand Ducal Tuscany while simultaneously planting the seeds of later decline. The siege that finally established Medici authority had been devastating, but it had also been decisive. And the ducal court that Eleonora and Cosimo created was built on foundations that would prove more durable than the Republican institutions they replaced. The city that had expelled the Medici twice would eventually accept their rule as natural and permanent, and the Duchess, who arrived in the aftermath of siege and devastation, would help make that acceptance possible. The man who would transform the scattered remnants of Medici power into a hereditary monarchy had not been born into the purple of Florentine politics, and he carried with him a perspective that the more privileged members of his family had never developed. Cosimo de' Medici, who would eventually become the first Grand Duke of Tuscany, was born in 1519, the year that the last Lorenzo died and the main line of the family seemed to have reached its end. His father was a minor Medici who had married into the Spanish nobility, and young Cosimo spent his early years far from the intrigues of Florence, in the more cosmopolitan atmosphere of the imperial court, where his family had found refuge after the expulsion of 1527. This exile, unlike the comfortable sojourns of earlier Medici refugees, was genuinely desperate, forcing Cosimo to develop the survival skills and diplomatic sensibilities that would later serve him so well. When the opportunity came to claim leadership of the Medici faction in Florence, Cosimo was prepared in ways that his more privileged relatives had never been. The chaos that followed the second expulsion of the Medici in 1527, when Florentine rebels overthrew the governing dynasty and declared a republic, created opportunities that the imperial authorities were eager to exploit. The republic that emerged from this upheaval was more radical than any that had preceded it, led by figures who genuinely believed in popular sovereignty and who were determined to establish governance on principles that the Medici had always rejected. The papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the various Italian states watched with alarm as the Florentine experiment developed, fearing that its success would inspire similar movements elsewhere. The imperial forces that eventually crushed the Republic in 1530 were not acting solely on Medici behalf. They were suppressing a threat to the entire structure of Italian politics that the Medici represented in concentrated form. Yet the Medici were the beneficiaries of this suppression, and Cosimo, who had emerged as the leader of the pro-imperial faction, was in position to claim the spoils of victory. The elevation of Cosimo to the Dukedom of Florence in 1537, following the murder of Alessandro de' Medici, represented a decisive break with the past that would shape Tuscan history for centuries to come. Cosimo understood that the old methods of informal dominance, which had served his ancestors so well, were no longer adequate to the challenges of a transformed political environment. The Republican experiment of 1527 had demonstrated that there were forces in Florentine society capable of challenging Medici authority, and those forces would need to be permanently suppressed if the family was to rule in safety. Cosimo created a new political order that combined the substance of absolute power with whatever trappings of legitimacy he could assemble, building a bureaucratic apparatus that served his personal authority rather than the traditional republican institutions. The dukedom that he established was not a restoration of the old order, but a genuinely new creation, a modern state that would outlast the dynasty that built it. The relationship between Cosimo I and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was the foundation upon which the Medici restoration was built, and Cosimo understood that his position depended on maintaining this alliance at all costs. The emperor had provided the military force that crushed the Florentine Republic, and he continued to provide the diplomatic backing that protected Medici interests against French and papal encroachment. In return, Cosimo offered the emperor a loyal ally in the heart of Italy, a client state whose resources and strategic position served Habsburg purposes throughout the peninsula. The marriage that Cosimo arranged with Eleonora of Toledo, daughter of the Viceroy of Naples, cemented this alliance at the most intimate level, binding the Medici family to the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Empire through ties of blood and interest. This dependency on foreign power was a departure from the more independent stance of earlier Medici rulers, but Cosimo recognized that the new political environment left him no alternative. The Grand Ducal title that Cosimo received from Pope Pius V in 1569 represented the final transformation of Medici power. From contested authority to acknowledged sovereignty, the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany was new, created specifically to honor Cosimo and his descendants, and it elevated the Medici from the ranks of Italian princes to a position of unique distinction in the hierarchy of European nobility. The ceremony in which the title was conferred was a spectacular affair, combining religious ritual with political celebration in a display that demonstrated both Medici wealth and papal favor. The new Grand Dukes were now acknowledged as sovereign rulers, their authority deriving from their own right rather than from delegation by the Florentine people or recognition by foreign powers. The transformation that had begun with Giovanni de' Bicci's banking operations had reached its culmination. The Medici had become royalty in everything but name. The cultural achievements of the Grand Ducal period represented a continuation and extension of the patronage that had characterized Medici rule since its earliest days. The court that Cosimo and Eleonora established at the Palazzo Pitti rivaled anything that Renaissance Italy had produced, a center of artistic production that attracted talent from across Europe. The artists and scholars who flourished under Grand Ducal patronage created works that transformed Florence from a repository of historical treasures into a living center of cultural innovation. The Uffizi Gallery, which Cosimo began constructing in 1560, was designed to house the art collections that the family had accumulated over generations, and it became the model for the public museums that would later emerge throughout Europe. The scientific achievements that were sponsored by the Grand Dukes, including Galileo's astronomical discoveries, represented a new direction in Medici patronage, supporting not merely the preservation of classical learning, but the creation of new knowledge that would transform humanity's understanding of the natural world. The decline of the Medici dynasty proceeded slowly and in stages as the family's male line gradually dwindled toward extinction. The last male of the main branch, Gian Gaston de' Medici, died in 1737 without heirs, and the Grand Ducal throne passed to the House of Lorraine through a succession settlement arranged by the major European powers. The transition was peaceful, engineered by diplomats who understood that the Medici era had ended and that new arrangements were needed to maintain stability in central Italy. The Lorraines continued to rule Tuscany until Italian unification in the 19th century, but they did so as successors to the Medici rather than as their continuations. The Medici name became associated with a glorious but irretrievable past, a symbol of artistic achievement and political power that no subsequent ruler could quite match. The legacy of the Medici extended far beyond the territories they ruled to encompass the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The Renaissance that they had sponsored and embodied was the bridge between medieval and modern worlds, a transformation in art, literature, science, and political thought that shaped everything that followed. The banking techniques that Giovanni de' Bicci developed were the ancestors of modern financial institutions, and the political methods that his descendants refined established patterns of statecraft that influenced rulers across Europe. The artistic treasures that the Medici accumulated and preserved remained in Florence, drawing visitors from around the world and demonstrating the enduring power of beauty and genius. The Medici had begun as bankers, and they ended as patrons of civilization, and their journey from the money-changing tables of Florence to the corridors of European power told a story that was at once specific to their time and universal in its significance. The The story of the Medici family thus encompassed the full range of human experience, from the accumulation of wealth through commerce and credit to the exercise of political power through manipulation and violence, from the patronage of art and science to the consolidation of hereditary monarchy. They had been exiles and rulers, bankers and princes, murderers and saints, and through it all they had maintained a continuity of purpose that linked the modest money changer of the 14th century to the Grand Dukes of the 18th. The family that began in the narrow streets of Florence had eventually influenced the course of European civilization, and the city that had expelled them twice had become their permanent monument. The Medici had created a legacy that transcended their own deaths, transforming the material and cultural landscape of Tuscany while establishing patterns of patronage and power that would inspire generations to come. Their story was, in the end, the story of the Renaissance itself, a transformation of the possible that changed everything that followed.